F. Ireland. In concluding this section, we must travel for a moment to Ireland. First, the main facts of the case. The population of Ireland had, in 1841, reached 8,222,664. In 1851, it had dwindled to 6,623,985. In 1861, to 5,850,309. In 1866 to 5.5 million, nearly to its level in 1801. The diminution began with the famine year, 1846, so that Ireland, in less than 20 years, lost more than 5/16 of its people. Footnote: population of Ireland, 1801, 5,319,867 persons, 1811, 6,084,996, 1821, 6,869,544, 1831, 7,828,347, 1841, 8,222,664. Back to the main text. Its total immigration from May 1851 to July 1865 numbered 1,591,487. The emigration during the years 1861 to 65 was more than 500,000. The number of inhabited houses fell from 1851 to 1861 by 52,990. From 1851 to 61, the number of holdings of 15 to 30 acres increased 61,000. That of holdings over 30 acres, 109,000, whilst the total number of all farms fell 120,000, a fall therefore solely due to the suppression of farms under 15 acres, i.e., to their centralization. Then we have a table, Table A, labeled Livestock, which shows the total number of horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs for each year from 1860 to 1865. Overall, the number of horses decreased from about 620,000 to 548,000. Cattle from 3.6 million to 3.5 million. Sheep increased slightly from 3.5 million to 3.7 million. And pigs increased just slightly from 1.27 million to 1.3 million. The decrease of the population was naturally accompanied by a decrease in the mass of products. For our purpose, it suffices to consider the 5 years from 1861 to 65, during which over 500,000 emigrated, and the absolute number of people sank by more than 1/3 of a million. From the above table, it results, and then there's a shorter table which just discusses the absolute decrease or increase in horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs. Footnote: the result would be found yet more unfavorable if we went further back. Thus, sheep in 1865, 3,688,742, but in 1856, almost the same number and slightly higher, 3,694,294. Pigs in 1865, 1,299,893, but in 1858, 1,409,883. Back to the main text. Let us now turn to agriculture, which yields the means of subsistence for cattle and for humans. In the following table is calculated the decrease or increase for each separate year, as compared with its immediate predecessor, so year-over-year increase or decrease. The cereal crops include wheat, oats, barley, rye, beans, and peas. The green crops, potatoes, turnips, marigolds, beetroot, cabbages, carrots, parsnips, vetches, etc. Then we have Table B, increase or decrease in the area under crops and grass in acreage. For cereal crops, there's a decrease every year. For green crops, there's a decrease every year except for 1865. For grass and clover, there's an increase every year except for 1861. For flax, there's an increase every year except for 1865. And total cultivated land, a decrease every year except for 1864. In all, cereal crops showed a decrease for this 5-year period. Green crops a decrease, grass and clover an increase, flax an increase, and total cultivated land a decrease. In the year 1865, 127,470 additional acres came under the heading grassland, chiefly because the area under the heading of bog and waste unoccupied decreased by 101,543 acres. If we compare 1865 with 1864, there's a decrease in cereals of 246,667 quarters, a quarter being 28 pounds, of which 48,999 were wheat, 160,605 oats, 29,892 barley, etc. The decrease in potatoes was 446,398 tons, although the area of their cultivation increased in 1865. From the movement of population and the agricultural produce of Ireland, we pass to the movement in the purse of its landlords, larger farmers, and industrial capitalists. It is reflected in the rise and fall of the income tax. It may be remembered that Schedule D, profits with the exception of those of farmers, includes also the so-called professional profits, meaning the income of lawyers, doctors, etc. And the Schedules C and E, in which no special details are given, includes the incomes of employees, officers, state sinecurists, state fund holders, etc. And then we have Table C, increase or decrease in the area under cultivation, product per acre, and total product of 1865 compared with 1864. This is a really large table which again breaks down the wheat, oats, barley, and other specific crops. There's a footnote there. The data of the text are put together from the materials of the Agricultural Statistics, Ireland General Abstracts, Dublin, for the years 1860 and following, and Agricultural Statistics, Ireland, tables showing the estimated average produce, etc., Dublin, 1866. These statistics are official and laid before Parliament annually. And there's a note to the second edition. The official statistics for the year 1872 show, as compared with 1871, a decrease in area under cultivation of 134,915 acres. An increase occurred in the cultivation of green crops, turnips, mangold, wurzel, and the like, this last thing being a species of beet. A decrease in the area under cultivation for wheat of 16,000 acres. Oats, 14,000. Barley and rye, 4,000. Potatoes, 66,632. Flax, 34,667. Grass, clover, vetches, rapeseed, 30,000. The soil under cultivation for wheat shows for the last 5 years the following stages of decrease. 1868, 285,000 acres. 1869, 280,000. 1870, 259,000. 1871, 244,000, 1872, 228,000. For 1872 we find, in round numbers, an increase of 2,600 horses, 80,000 horned cattle, 68,609 sheep, and a decrease of 236,000 pigs. Returning to the main text, we see Table D, the income tax on the subjoined incomes in pounds sterling, from the 10th Report of the Commissioners of Inland Revenue, London, 1866. I'll put that on the screen, and Marx says, under Schedule D, the average annual increase of income from 1853 to 1864 was only 0.93, whilst in the same period in Great Britain it was 4.58. The following table shows the distribution of the profits, with the exception of those of farmers, for the years 1864 and 1865. Then we have Table E, which is titled Schedule D, Income from Profits over £60 in Ireland. And it has figures for 1864 and 1865 for the total yearly income, the yearly income over £60 and under £100, then a field labeled of the yearly total income, then remainder of the total yearly income, then a field titled of these, which summarizes it. And basically what Marx has done is to take the yearly income and say how many people it's divided among. So for example, for 1864, it says 1,073,906 divided among 1,010 persons, but there's also 262,819 divided among 3. And that inequality increases in the next year. Then there's a footnote. The total yearly income under Schedule D is different in this table from that which appears in the preceding ones because of certain deductions allowed by law. Back to the main text. England, a country with fully developed capitalist production and preeminently industrial, would have bled to death with such a drain of population as Ireland has suffered. But Ireland is at present only an agricultural district of England, marked off by a wide channel from the country to which it yields corn, wool, cattle, industrial, and military recruits. The depopulation of Ireland has thrown much of the land out of cultivation, has greatly diminished the produce of the soil. Footnote, if the product also diminishes relatively per acre, it must not be forgotten that for a century and a half, England has indirectly exported the soil of Ireland, without as much as allowing its cultivators the means for making up the constituents of the soil that has been exhausted. Back to the main text, and in spite of the greater area devoted to cattle breeding, has brought about in some of its branches an absolute diminution, in others an advance scarcely worthy of mention, and constantly interrupted by retrogressions. Nevertheless, with the fallen numbers of the population, rents and farmers' profits rose, although the latter not as steadily as the former. The reason of this is easily comprehensible. On the one hand, with the throwing of small holdings into large ones, and the change of arable into pasture land, a larger part of the whole produce was transformed into surplus produce. The surplus produce increased, although the total produce, of which it formed a fraction, decreased. On the other hand, the money value of this surplus produce increased yet more rapidly than its mass, in consequence of the rise in the English market price of meat, wool, etc. during the last 20 and especially during the last 10 years. The scattered means of production that serve the producers themselves as means of employment and of subsistence, without expanding their own value by the incorporation of the labor of others, are no more capital than a product consumed by its own producer is a commodity. If, with the mass of the population, that of the means of production employed in agriculture also diminished, the mass of the capital employed in agriculture increased because a part of the means of production that were formerly scattered was concentrated and turned into capital. The total capital of Ireland outside agriculture, employed in industry and trade, accumulated during the last 2 decades slowly and with great and constantly recurring fluctuations. So much the more rapidly did the concentration of its individual constituents develop, and however small its absolute increase, in proportion to the dwindling population, it had increased largely. Here then, under our own eyes and on a large scale, a process is revealed, than which nothing more excellent could be wished for by orthodox economy for the support of its dogma, that misery springs from absolute surplus population, and that equilibrium is re-established by depopulation. This is a far more important experiment than was the plague in the middle of the 14th century, so belauded of Malthusians. Note further, if only the naivete of the schoolmaster could apply to the conditions of production and population of the 19th century, the standard of the 14th, this naivete into the bargain overlooked the fact that whilst, after the plague and the decimation that accompanied it, followed on this side of the Channel in England, enfranchisement and enrichment of the agricultural population, on that side, in France, followed greater servitude and more misery. Footnote, as Ireland is regarded as the promised land of the so-called principle of population, Sadler, before the publication of his work on population, issued his famous book, Ireland, Its Evils and Their Remedies, 2nd edition, London, 1829. Here, by comparison of the statistics of the individual provinces and of the individual counties in each province, he proves that the misery there is not, as Malthus would have it, in proportion to the number of the population, but in inverse ratio to this. Back to the main text. The Irish famine of 1846 killed more than 1 million people, but it killed poor devils only. To the wealth of the country it did not the slightest damage. The exodus of the next 20 years, an exodus still constantly increasing, it did not, as for example the 30 Years' War, decimate, along with the human beings, their means of production. Irish genius discovered an altogether new way of spiriting a poor people thousands of miles away from the scene of its misery. The exiles transplanted to the United States send home sums of money every year as traveling expenses for those left behind. Every troop that emigrates one year draws another after it the next. Thus, instead of costing Ireland anything, emigration forms one of the most lucrative branches of its export trade. Finally, it is a systematic process, which does not simply make a passing gap in the population, but sucks out of it every year more people than are replaced by the births, so that the absolute level of the population falls year by year. Footnote, between 1851 and 1874, the total number of immigrants amounted to 2,325,922. Back to the main text. What were the consequences for the Irish laborers left behind and freed from the surplus population? That the relative surplus population is today as great as before 1846, that wages are just as low, that the oppression of the laborers has increased, that misery is forcing the country toward a new crisis. The facts are simple. The revolution in agriculture has kept pace with emigration. The production of relative surplus population has more than kept pace with the absolute depopulation. A glance at Table C shows that the change of arable to pasture land must work yet more acutely in Ireland than in England. In England, the cultivation of green crops increases with the breeding of cattle. In Ireland, it decreases. Whilst a large number of acres that were formerly tilled lie idle or are turned permanently into grassland, a great part of the wasteland and peat bogs that were unused formerly become of service for the extension of cattle breeding. The smaller and medium farmers, I reckon among these all who do not cultivate more than 100 acres, still make up about 8/10 of the whole number. Footnote, according to a table in Murphy's Ireland, Industrial, Political, and Social, 1870, 94.6% of the holdings do not reach 100 acres. 5.4 exceed 100 acres. Back to the main text. They are one after the other, and with a degree of force unknown before, crushed by the competition of an agriculture managed by capital, and therefore they continually furnish new recruits to the class of wage laborers. The one great industry of Ireland, linen manufacture, requires relatively few adult men, and only employs altogether, in spite of its expansion, since the price of cotton rose in 1861 to 6, a comparatively insignificant part of the population. Like all other great modern industries, it constantly produces, by incessant fluctuations, a relative surplus population within its own sphere, even with an absolute increase in the mass of human beings absorbed by it. The misery of the agricultural population forms the pedestal for gigantic shirt factories, whose armies of laborers are, for the most part, scattered over the country. Here we encounter again the system described above of domestic industry, which, in underpayment and overwork, possesses its own systematic means for creating supernumerary laborers. Finally, although the depopulation has not such destructive consequences as would result in a country with fully developed capitalistic production, it does not go on without constant reaction upon the home market. The gap which emigration causes here limits not only the local demand for labor, but also the incomes of small shopkeepers, artisans, tradespeople generally. Hence the diminution in incomes between £60 and £100 in Table E. A clear statement of the condition of the agricultural laborers in Ireland is to be found in the reports of the Irish Poor Law Inspectors, 1870. Footnote, full title, Reports from the Poor Law Inspectors on the Wages of Agricultural Laborers in Dublin, 1870. See also, Agricultural Laborers Ireland, Return, etc., 8 March, 1861, London, 1862. Back to the main text. Officials of a government which is maintained only by bayonets and by a state of siege, now open, now disguised, they have to observe all the precautions of language that their colleagues in England disdain. In spite of this, however, they do not let their government cradle itself in illusions. According to them, the rate of wages in the country, still very low, has within the last 20 years risen 50 to 60%, and stands now on the average at 6 shillings to 9 shillings per week. But behind this apparent rise is hidden an actual fall in wages, for it does not correspond at all to the rise in price of the necessary means of subsistence that has taken place in the meantime. For proof, see the following extract from the official accounts of an Irish workhouse. And there's a chart, average weekly cost per head, year ending 1849 versus 1869, and it shows that the total cost for provisions, necessaries, and clothing has gone up from 1 shilling 6 1/4 pence to 3 shillings 1 1/4 pence. The price of the necessary means of subsistence is therefore fully twice, and that of clothing exactly twice as much as they were 20 years before. Even apart from this disproportion, the mere comparison of the rate of wages expressed in gold would give a result far from accurate. Before the famine, the great mass of agricultural wages were paid in kind, only the smallest part in money. Today, payment in money is the rule. From this it follows that, whatever the amount of the real wage, its money rate must rise. Quote, previous to the famine, the laborer enjoyed his cabin, with a rood or half-acre or acre of land, and facilities for a crop of potatoes. He was able to rear his pig and keep fowl, but they now have to buy bread, and they have no refuse upon which they can feed a pig or fowl. And they have consequently no benefit from the sale of a pig, fowl, or eggs, unquote. That and about the dozen next quotes are from that Reports of the Poor Law Inspectors. Continuing, in fact, formerly, the agricultural laborers were but the smallest of the small farmers, and formed for the most part a kind of rear guard of the medium and large farms on which they found employment. Only since the catastrophe of 1846 have they begun to form a fraction of the class of purely wage laborers, a special class connected with its wage masters only by monetary relations. We know what were the conditions of their dwellings in 1846. Since then they have grown yet worse. A part of the agricultural laborers, which, however, grows less day by day, dwells still on the holdings of the farmers in overcrowded huts, whose hideousness far surpasses the worst that the English agricultural laborers offered us in this way. and this holds generally with the exception of certain tracts of Ulster, in the south, in the counties of Cork, Limerick, Kilkenny, etc., in the east in Wicklow, Wexford, etc., in the centre of Ireland, in Kings and Queens County, Dublin, etc., in the west, in Sligo, Roscommon, Mayo, Galway, etc. Quote, "The agricultural laborers' huts," an inspector cries out, "are a disgrace to the Christianity and to the civilization of this country." Unquote. In order to increase the attraction of these holes for the laborers, the pieces of land belonging thereto from time immemorial are systematically confiscated. Quote, "The mere sense that they exist subject to the species of ban on the part of the landlords and their agents has given birth in the minds of the laborers to corresponding sentiments of antagonism and dissatisfaction toward those by whom they are thus led to regard themselves as being treated as a proscribed race." Unquote. The first act of the agricultural revolution was to sweep away the huts situated on the field of labor. This was done on the largest scale and as if in obedience to a command from on high. Thus many laborers were compelled to seek shelter in villages and towns. There they were thrown like refuse into garrets, holes, cellars, and corners in the worst back slums. Thousands of Irish families who, according to the testimony of the English, eaten up as these are with national prejudice, are notable for their rare attachment to the domestic hearth, for their gaiety and the purity of their home life, found themselves suddenly transplanted into hotbeds of vice. The men are now obliged to seek work of the neighboring farmers and are only hired by the day, and therefore under the most precarious form of wage. Hence, quote, "They sometimes have long distances to go to and from work, often get wet, and suffer much hardship, not unfrequently ending in sickness, disease, and want." Another quote, "The towns have had to receive from year to year what was deemed to be the surplus labor of the rural division," unquote. And then people still wonder, quote, "There is still a surplus of labor in the towns and villages, and either a scarcity or a threatened scarcity in some of the country divisions," unquote. The truth is that this want only becomes perceptible, quote, "in harvest time, or during spring, or at such times as agricultural operations are carried on with activity. At other periods of the year many hands are idle," unquote. That, quote, "from the digging out of the main crop of potatoes in October until the early spring following there is no employment for them," unquote. And further, that during the active times they, quote, "are subject to broken days and to all kinds of interruptions," unquote. These results of the agricultural revolution, i.e. the change of arable into pasture land, the use of machinery, the most rigorous economy of labor, etc., are still further aggravated by the model landlords who, instead of spending their rents in other countries, condescend to live in Ireland on their domains. In order that the law of supply and demand may not be broken, these gentlemen draw their, quote, "labor supply chiefly from their small tenants, who are obliged to attend, when required to do the landlord's work, at rates of wages, in many instances, considerably under the current rates paid to ordinary laborers, and without regard to the inconvenience or loss to the tenant of being obliged to neglect their own business at critical periods of sowing or reaping," unquote. The uncertainty and irregularity of employment, the constant return and long duration of gluts of labor, all these symptoms of a relative surplus population, figure therefore in the reports of the Poor Law Administration as so many hardships of the agricultural proletariat. It will be remembered that we met in the English agricultural proletariat with a similar spectacle, but the difference is that in England, an industrial country, the industrial reserve recruits itself from the country districts, whilst in Ireland, an agricultural country, the agricultural reserve recruits itself from the towns, the cities of refuge of the expelled agricultural laborers. In the former, the supernumeraries of agriculture are transformed into factory operatives. In the latter, those forced into the towns, whilst at the same time they press on the wages in towns, remain agricultural laborers, and are constantly sent back to the country districts in search of work. The official inspectors sum up the material condition of the agricultural laborer as follows, quote, "Though living with the strictest frugality, his own wages are barely sufficient to provide food for an ordinary family and pay his rent," unquote, and he depends upon other sources for the means of clothing himself, his wife, and children. The atmosphere of these cabins, combined with the other privations they are subjected to, has made this class particularly susceptible to low fever and pulmonary consumption," unquote. After this, it is no wonder that, according to the unanimous testimony of the inspectors, a somber discontent runs through the ranks of this class, that they long for the return of the past. Comment, think of Lenin's discussions of the Narodniks in Russia, continuing, "Loathe the present, despair of the future, give themselves up, quote, to the evil influence of agitators," unquote, and have only one fixed idea, to emigrate to America. This is the land of cocaine, into which the great Malthusian panacea, depopulation, has transformed Green Erin. What a happy life the Irish factory operative leads, one example will show. Quote, "On my recent visit to the north of Ireland," says the English factory inspector Robert Baker, "I met with the following evidence of effort in an Irish skilled workman to afford education to his children, and I give his evidence verbatim as I took it from his mouth. That he was a skilled factory hand may be understood when I say that he was employed on goods for the Manchester market." Quote, Johnson, "I am a beetler and work from 6 in the morning till 11 at night from Monday to Friday. Saturday we leave off at 6 p.m. and get 3 hours of it for meals and rest. I have 5 children in all. For this work I get 10 shillings 6 pence a week. My wife works here also and gets 5 shillings a week. The oldest girl, who is 12, minds the house. She is also cook and all the servant we have. She gets the young ones ready for school. A girl going past the house wakes me at 5:30 in the morning. My wife gets up and goes along with me. We get nothing to eat before we come to work. The child of 12 takes care of the little children all the day, and we get nothing till breakfast at 8. At 8 we go home. We get tea once a week. At other times we get stirabout, sometimes of oatmeal, sometimes of Indian meal as we're able to get it. In the winter we get a little sugar and water to our Indian meal. Comment, Indian meal is cornmeal, so like a polenta. And it was considered a sign of poverty, so if you had corn instead of oats, that was considered a step down. Continuing, in the summer we get a few potatoes, planting a small patch ourselves, and when they are done we get back to stirabout. Sometimes we get a little milk as it may be. So we go on from day to day, Sunday and weekday, always the same the year round. I am always very much tired when I have done at night. We may see a bit of flesh meat sometimes, but very seldom. 3 of our children attend school, for whom we pay 1 penny a week a head. Our rent is 9 pence a week. Peat for firing costs us 1 shilling 6 pence a fortnight at the very lowest." Unquote. Such are Irish wages, such is Irish life. In fact, the misery of Ireland is again the topic of the day in England. At the end of 1866 and the beginning of 1867, one of the Irish land magnates, Lord Dufferin, said about its solution in the Times, "How human of such a great lord." From Table E we saw that during 1864, out of £4,368,610 of total profits, 3 surplus value makers pocketed only £262,819. That in 1865, however, out of £4,669,979 total profits, the same 3 virtuosi of quote-unquote abstinence pocketed £274,528. In 1864, 26 surplus value makers reached to £646,377. In 1865, 28 surplus value makers reached to £736,448. In 1864, 121 surplus value makers, £1,076,912. In 1865, 150 surplus value makers, £1,320,906. In 1864, 1,131 surplus value makers, £2,150,818, nearly half of the total annual profit. In 1865, 1,194 surplus value makers, £2,418,833, more than half of the total annual profit. But the lion's share, which an inconceivably small number of land magnates in England, Scotland, and Ireland swallow up of the yearly national rental, is so monstrous that the wisdom of the English state does not think fit to afford the same statistical materials about the distribution of rents as about the distribution of profits. Lord Dufferin is one of those land magnates. That rent rolls and profits can ever be excessive, or that their plethora is in any way connected with plethora of the people's misery, is of course an idea as quote-unquote disreputable as quote-unquote unsound. He keeps to facts. The fact is that, as the Irish population diminishes, the Irish rent rolls swell. That depopulation benefits the landlords, therefore also benefits the soil, and therefore the people, that mere accessory of the soil. He declares, therefore, that Ireland is still overpopulated, and the stream of emigration still flows too lazily. To be perfectly happy, Ireland must get rid of at least 1/3 of a million of laboring men. Let no man imagine that this lord, poetic into the bargain, is a physician of the school of San Grado, who, as often as he did not find his patient better, ordered phlebotomy and again phlebotomy until his patient lost his sickness at the same time as his blood. Lord Dufferin demands a new bloodletting of 1/3 of a million only, instead of about 2 millions. In fact, without the getting rid of these, the millennium in Erin is not to be. The proof is easily given. And there's a chart here, the number and extent of farms in Ireland in 1864, and there's a footnote that says that the total area includes also peat, bogs, and wasteland. The total area is 26,319,924 acres, and then there are 7 categories of farms of different sizes. The largest is farms over 100 acres at 8.2 million. Then the farms between 50 and 100 are 3.98 million. Then the farms between 50 and 30 and 30 and 50 acres are about the same at 3 million and 2.9 million respectively. Then it goes down from there. Between 5 and 15 are 1.8 million. Between 1 and 5 are 289,000. And not over 1 acre, 25,394. Continuing, centralization has from 1851 to 1861 destroyed principally farms of the first 3 categories, the smallest, under 1 and not over 15 acres. These above all must disappear. This gives 307,058 supernumerary farmers, and reckoning the families the low average of 4 persons, 1,228,232 persons. On the extravagant supposition that, after the agricultural revolution is complete, 1/4 of these are again absorbable, there remain for immigration 921,174 persons. Categories 4, 5, and 6 of over 15 and not over 100 acres are, as was known long since in England, too small for capitalistic cultivation of corn, and for sheep breeding are almost vanishing quantities. On the same supposition as before, therefore, there are further 788,761 persons to emigrate. Total, 1,709,532. And as the appetite comes in eating, rent roll's eyes will soon discover that Ireland, with 3.5 millions, is still always miserable, and miserable because she is overpopulated. Therefore, her depopulation must go yet further, that thus she may fulfill her true destiny, that of an English sheepwalk and cattle pasture. Footnote: how the famine and its consequences have been deliberately made the most of, both by the individual landlords and by the English legislature, to forcibly carry out the agricultural revolution and to thin the population of Ireland down to the proportion satisfactory to the landlords, I shall show more fully in Volume 3 of this work, in the section on landed property. There also I return to the condition of the small farmers and the agricultural laborers. At present, only one quotation. Nassau W. Sr. says, with other things, in his posthumous work, Journals, Conversations, and Essays Relating to Ireland, 2 volumes, London, 1868, Volume 2, quote, "Well, said Dr. G, we have got our poor law, and it is a great instrument for giving the victory to the landlords. Another, and a still more powerful instrument, is emigration. No friend to Ireland can wish the war to be prolonged, that is, the war between the landlords and the small Celtic farmers, and still less that it should end by the victory of the tenants. The sooner it is over, the sooner Ireland becomes a grazing country, with the comparatively thin population which a grazing country requires, the better for all classes." Unquote. The English Corn Laws of 1815 secured Ireland the monopoly of the free importation of corn into Great Britain. They favored artificially, therefore, the cultivation of corn. With the abolition of the Corn Laws in 1846, this monopoly was suddenly removed. Apart from all other circumstances, this event alone was sufficient to give a great impulse to the turning of Irish arable into pasture land, to the concentration of farms, and to the eviction of small cultivators. After the fruitfulness of the Irish soil had been praised from 1815 to 1846, and proclaimed loudly as by nature herself destined for the cultivation of wheat, English agronomists, economists, politicians discover suddenly that it is good for nothing but to produce forage. M. Léonce de Laverne has hastened to repeat this on the other side of the channel. It takes a, quote, serious man, a la Laverne, to be caught by such childishness. Back to the main text. Like all good things in this bad world, this profitable method has its drawbacks. With the accumulation of rents in Ireland, the accumulation of the Irish in America keeps pace. The Irishman, banished by sheep and ox, reappears on the other side of the ocean as a Fenian, and face to face with the old queen of the seas rises, threatening and more threatening, to the young giant republic. A cruel fate torments the Romans, and the crime of fratricide. And that is the end of Chapter 25, the second longest chapter in Capital Volume 1. And what an amazing chapter. Like chapter 15, it is replete with accounts of the conditions described in great detail that people had to work and live in, and how the rising capitalist class engineered, implemented, and maintained those conditions, and then continued to expand them for the sake of accumulation. Of course, just a few countries were the main focus here, but this model of analysis could be applied to many other countries as well. So, you've now made it through part 7 of 8. What did you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. It really makes a difference, so if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it is just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online pretty effectively, but the organizing and real struggle takes place in real life. So make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next video.